Hi, it's Tom here from Running Physio, and in today's video I want to talk to you a bit about a topic that I think is so important for our runners, and that's how they train. We think roughly 60 to 70% of injuries in runners are due to training error, so how they train is really important. A lot of runners actually aspire to train like some of the world's best athletes, but there's lots of misconceptions and myths around that. So in this video, I want to drill down into a nice recent review into how world-class runners actually train. And actually, there's quite a few surprising things in there that are going to be quite useful for us to share with our runners and actually see what we can take from this recent review to runners we see in clinic, injured runners, what advice we can give them around their training structure and progression to keep them running and progress them back to where they want to be. I've also put a link to our collection of free injury videos we've got a great one on iliotibial band syndrome, one on lateral hip pain, lots of great videos there, do check those out. And the main paper from this, How Gonna Tool, I'll share in the comments afterwards. So let's start by having a look at some of the details around how some of these world-class athletes train. And these are marathon runners and track athletes. We're not really talking about sprinters in this particular video. Now, How Gonna Tool reviewed this really nicely, and they say generally they're looking at 11 to 14 training sessions per week. So quite high volume training with a weekly distance of 160 to 220 kilometers per week for marathon runners, and a bit less, 130 to 190 kilometers per week for track runners. So they're going to do high volume, a lot higher than most of our recreational runners that we see. And we're not going to be suggesting to our injured runners that they're going to try and replicate that. But one part of their training that we probably will suggest to try and replicate is that approximately 80% of this training is done at low intensity. And this is really quite an important nugget to take away, that we think probably for our endurance athletes, it's mainly low intensity training that they need to focus on. Now, this is really relevant for our patients. I can think of 3 or 4 patients just off the top of my head that when we look at their training week, they definitely haven't got that balance right. We're certainly not looking at 80% of their training being low intensity. They might have 4 runs and 3 of them are high intensity sessions. So that's quite a positive message we can give to people. You don't have to train so hard all the time. You don't need to make the majority of your work high intensity. And the research behind it, stuff like Stephen Seiler's work, suggests that doing more high intensity work does not lead to better improvements in performance. So that's quite a useful nugget to take away, share with our runners. Let's reduce down some of that intensity if it's not needed and it's not helpful, and therefore hopefully reduce your running injury risk. Now, as ever, this is going to be relevant to specific patients that you see and sometimes specific pathologies. Some running injuries like Achilles tendinopathy and hamstring tendinopathy, the loads on those tendons are going to be significantly higher at higher speed. So if they're doing far too much high intensity, that is really likely to flare up their symptoms. So this is where we need to make these connections between how people train, the load it might be placing on sensitive tissues, and then the changes that we can make. So nice simple thing to take away there around intensity. Now, there's a nice summary here that comes from Bill Bowerman's training philosophy that kind of summarizes how a lot of these world-class athletes will train. So they're saying they're going to be doing 2 to 3 weekly interval sessions, a weekly long run, and fill the rest with as much low intensity training as you can handle. Now, that might well be really appropriate for these people that are doing 11 to 14 sessions per week. If they're covering 160 kilometers plus per week, then yes, perhaps you can do 2 or 3 interval sessions within that if you're trained for it. But for the majority of our recreational athletes we see, they may be doing 3 or 4 sessions a week. Some of them, 1 tough session a week is often enough for them, especially as they're coming back from injury. So we need to be realistic and think about the individual and think about what type of training is likely to flare up their symptoms. Now, something else to bear in mind is that us runners, we do like to try and train like the elites, but we don't necessarily have the same training history, the same build, the same genetics as the elites. And if you look into how they kind of prepare themselves for this training, what you see again based on Haugen et al.'s review is that athletes are training systematically for about 8 to 10 years before they reach international level. So it takes a long time for them to build up that training tolerance to manage this level that they're at. And a lot of our recreational athletes want to get there quickly, but it's going to take many years to build the tolerance. So we want to encourage our runners, particularly those with injuries, to be patient and build gradually. And that's what these world-class athletes are doing. They're going to build their volume typically over about 8 to 12 weeks, gradually building it based on how they're feeling. And then they're going to look to try and replicate race conditions within their training. So they might train in heat if it's a hot environment that they're competing in. They might train at altitude on specific surfaces, or at particular times of the day if it's an early morning event, or even in certain time zones. And that's something we want to try and do to some degree with our athletes. It's simple stuff really. If they want to complete a road marathon, they need to go and do their longest runs on the road. They need to get their body used to handling the impact and running on those types of surfaces. And we can replicate their training volume, how much, and intensity, how hard, with cross-training as a way of building fitness with an exercise modality that has less load on sensitive tissues. So we stay with that Achilles example. A runner coming in with Achilles pain, and if they still want to do high-intensity work, if we get them to do that on a bike, the load on the Achilles is significantly less, particularly if they're sat. So they could still have a high-intensity workout as far as the heart and lungs are concerned, but they're not likely to irritate the Achilles so much. So it's a little bit of reasoning that goes into all this, and that's something I'd really encourage. It's reasoning rather than rigid recipes when it comes to training. So you can see with these world-class athletes, a lot of time and effort goes into building their fitness and preparing their body to compete at these highest levels. But then when it comes into their training year, their macro cycle, they're going to have typically 3 phases. And again, this is all described in Haugen et al., which I'll link for you after. So they describe these 3 phases. The first phase is a preparatory phase. So to prepare them for competition. And in that, they start with general preparation. And this is about building high training volume, typically with low intensity, to get an aerobic base. Again, this is very relevant to our patients. When they're coming back from injury, we often want to build volume first and build up that aerobic base before introducing tougher high intensity runs, particularly if those runs are provocative for their symptoms. So they start with this general preparation, then they move on to more specific preparation, and they increase the training, particularly expose them more to race pace. Again, that's something you would want to do during the training progression for someone. At some point, we've got to get them used to the pace that they need to race at. And then towards the end of this preparatory phase, there's going to be a taper. Now, these athletes are very fit. They recover very quickly. So they might have a short taper of 7 to 10 days pre-race where they maintain the training intensity where they can, but they reduce the training volume, the amount they're doing, to reduce fatigue. Now, for a lot of our runners, they're typically going to have a longer taper of maybe 2 to 3 weeks, but we can use these prior to an event like a marathon to settle down any lingering symptoms and reduce fatigue ready for the event. So phase 1 is preparation. Phase 2 then is competition. They're going to compete in that key event. They might have 2 or 3 key events across the year, perhaps more if they're a track runner. And then the third phase is transition. So recovering from that competition with 1 to 2 weeks of reduced training volume to allow recovery post-race. Now, there's going to be a lot of variety out there in the details for this and exactly how it's going to be done for each athlete. It's going to vary significantly across different events, I would imagine. It also will with our runners that we see in clinic. But this same idea is useful for us if you're bringing back someone after running injury. First of all, we want to prepare them for whatever their goal event is. We start by building some volume, then we start bringing in some intensity and expose them to race pace. Then we have a taper to allow them to recover and reduce fatigue so they're fit and ready to go for race day. After race day, they need that transition period to recover again before they might think about getting into their next training plan for whatever event they might want to do. Now, a lot of athletes will integrate their strength and conditioning into this, and just like every aspect, it's planned and executed very carefully. Now, of course, we live in the real world with real athletes. We know this is not easy to do, but as another key point to take from what we're talking about here, wherever we can, if we can plan this process so that things change gradually at a level someone can cope with, we're much more likely to get results. I'm often surprised to see runners doing training out there that isn't really targeted towards their specific goals, isn't especially planned, and is often far too much for what they're actually able to do. So we might want to include some strength and conditioning in this, and this would then probably sit alongside these phases that we've talked about. So during this preparation phase prior to competition, this is probably where the strength and conditioning is going to come in. Now, in the early phases, we might be looking at 2 to 3 sessions a week of relatively heavy load to develop strength, and hopefully including some power, some plyometric work in there, because it's very important to develop strength and power. Now, we can do that when the training volume is relatively low, but as we build and we hit peak training volume, as we're moving towards a specific phase where there's more race pace involved, we often need to back off with the strength and conditioning to a maintenance dose of maybe once a week. So we're going to periodize that strength and conditioning for our runner so that they're not trying to combine high volume, high intensity training with also doing 2 or 3 sessions of strength work a week, which is going to create a lot of fatigue, as you can imagine. And this again is going to run parallel to what we would do in rehab. Quite often in the early stages as they're coming back into running, we're going to continue their strength work. We're going to aim to really get them as strong as we can. And then as they're getting more into developing the training itself, we reduce that strength work down to a maintenance dose to keep the strength they've developed. Then as we go towards competition, we're going for minimal effective dose, trying to maintain the strength they've got, maybe actually cutting out the strength work, particularly as they get close to the competition in the last sort of 4 or 5 days, or just maintaining once a week, because a focus during competition and afterwards as well in transition is on recovery and fatigue management. So we wouldn't want to be going in with very high volume strength training that's then going to lead to fatigue and actually have a negative impact on a runner when it comes to their race. And this is something I spend a lot of time doing with runners. It's trying to strike that balancing act we have, thinking about what is the priority for them at each different phase of their rehab. In the early stages where maybe they are testing quite weak with our strength tests, yes, often we do need to restore that strength as a priority. So we want 2 or 3 good strength sessions in there a week. As they progress on through and they've hit those strength goals, strength becomes less of a priority, and actually building the running tolerance is key for them, for their goals. So we can focus more on the running, we can take the pressure off them, allow them to back off on the strength a little bit and just maintain what they've got. Now, goals with this are so important for our runners. I think it's really vital that we know their goal at session 1, because it makes a massive difference to how you want to train. If you've got someone who wants to do a marathon in under 3 hours, they're going to train very differently from someone who just wants to get round dressed as a badger and they're not really concerned what time they're going to do it in. Now, to illustrate this, there's quite a nice resource out there you can use called the Macmillan calculator, which will estimate the goal paces for each run. Now, this then is based on someone who's aiming for a sub 4-hour marathon. So that specific goal will actually drive the training paces they need during their training. Now, this is a more complex end of the spectrum when we're drilling down into intensity. This is often where I'd involve a running coach, but it's quite common that we find that someone's training a lot faster than their recommended pace is, and that again may be a piece of the injury puzzle. So here, for example, for the long, slow run, which is key in marathon training, for this person that's aiming for a sub 4-hour marathon, it's going to be 9 minutes 30 to 10 minutes 45 per mile. An easy effort, and our rate of perceived exertion, our RPE, is going to be low, 2 to 4. And really, this is the low intensity kind of region where a lot of the training is going to take place. Their tempo run is going to be medium effort. The pace, 8 minutes 30 to 8 minutes 45 per mile. Effort-wise, a bit more, 4 to about 7 out of 10. And then if we're doing intervals, obviously these are going to be hard, but they're going to be short. So if they're doing the interval session of 400-meter intervals, perhaps looking at 7:15 to 7:45 per mile and 7 to 9 on that effort scale. And that's something we'll often do with training, is there's a bit of a balancing act between training duration and intensity. As training duration increases, the intensity tends to be less, like your long, slow run. If you're going to push intensity hard, then quite often you'll reduce the duration. So our interval sessions are typically short. And this is another thing I tend to see with runners that pick up injuries. They might be doing really long interval sessions, 10 to 15 kilometers across those sessions. That is very, very difficult for them to maintain if their body's not coping with it or not used to it. And if they're coming to you with pain, particularly if they get pain in that session, it's giving you a clue that it isn't really coping with it. So we want to find out what those goals are, and then we want to see, is their training appropriate for that goal? Is it excessive? Are they going well above their training paces in all their runs, and they're working harder than they need to be, in which case they can back off? Is it modified to their individual needs, the injury they have, but also them as a person, their age and their capacity, their ability to cope with things, their recovery? Are they getting enough sleep? Are they super stressed? Are they getting enough nutrition? In that situation, if someone's training much harder than they need to be and they're not recovering well, they're not getting adequate nutrition, that is likely to lead to some pains at some point unless it is addressed. So hopefully some useful information to take from some of this research in world-class runners. And a lot of our recreational runners actually can work a little bit less hard that they're doing at the moment. They can go a little bit easier and perhaps get better results. They can plan their training a bit more and hopefully reduce their risk of injury and improve performance. So if I was to try and boil this down then into a collection of a few simple top tips if you're working with injured athletes, first up I think is we've got to find what is manageable as a first starting point for your athlete. What is a manageable amount of running? And by manageable we mean you get minimal pain during the run and no lasting reaction into the next day afterwards. That's a very important first step. Then we want to build gradually towards their end goal. Typically build volume first and then intensity. In terms of how quickly you build, typically you might be increasing the weekly volume by around 5 to 20%, but that will vary significantly depending on the individual. Sometimes they will want to go a bit more quickly if they've got a key event on the horizon, and that can be okay if they're happy to accept that risk. Then we're going to need to modify their training based on their individual needs and capacity and their response to it. If they're getting a flare up in their symptoms, for example, we may need to back off certain aspects of the training or replace it with cross training. If you want to help them with the intensity side, we can monitor that with RPE score, so rate of perceived exertion, or training pace to see if it matches their goal paces for their particular event. And this is sometimes going to be a very, very simple thing. Recently suggested to a runner that he started to introduce some medium intensity runs. He was coming back after hamstring tendon pain, and the problem area for him was building intensity. So we talked about going from slow speed to medium intensity. And he went off and he did that. He came back and he said it really flared his symptoms up. So I asked him what was his RPE score for that session, and he said it was 9 out of 10. So he was absolutely going for it for the full, I think it was 5K in that particular session. So we then spoke and said, really, probably you're looking at starting at maybe 5 out of 10 here. This should be lower level effort, medium intensity. So it's a simple thing, but get people used to scoring their sessions out of 10 in terms of effort and check that they're roughly where they want to be. A lot of very well motivated runners will push themselves hard in every session, and they don't necessarily need to do that. So we want to check in with that and use RPE as a way of monitoring intensity. We want to look at adapting the weekly set schedule around symptoms and around managing fatigue. So again, simple example. Recently, we have a runner that's doing a long, slow run on a Sunday, longest run of the week, and then does his toughest track session on a Monday. So he's trying to do his track session very fatigued on tired legs from maybe 18 or 20 miles the day before. Simple change would be to push that a bit later in the week to allow him to recover from his longest run. So have a look at the schedule, see what you can do. Simple changes are going to be good. You can, if you feel confident, plan 4-week training blocks with people. So they may build one aspect of their training, perhaps training volume, over 3 weeks, and have the 4th week as a recovery week. So we've planned that recovery in there. And often this does feel a bit complex, but we can look for really simple solutions here. The odd extra day of recovery can make quite a big difference sometimes, or even just setting a really simple initial goal of saying, let's get you up to a point where you're running for about 30 minutes, maybe 3 times a week. Let's not worry too much about the other training aspects just yet. Let's just get to that. That's quite a nice level to build from, and it might be then you want to start to involve a running coach or bring someone else into the picture. And the final tip here is recovery is just as important as training, particularly sleep. So we want to aim for a good 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night to really help people to adapt from their training. Now, final thing I've highlighted here is that if you've got someone with very high performance focused goals, then I'd really encourage you to work with a running coach or exercise physiologist to achieve those goals. We all need to be aware of our limits. And I know, for example, I feel very happy returning runners after injury. I love that phase of rehab, getting them back to running. I really enjoy building them back in and seeing them getting back into what they love. But I'm not performance trained. I'm not a running coach. I'm not an exercise physiologist. So if a runner comes to me and says, my goal is a sub 3 hour marathon, I want you to plan the whole 16-week training program for me, that's not for me. I might guide them back to a level of running, but as soon as I feel that they need more than I'm able to offer, I want to get a running coach involved, get their expert opinion and team up for the runner. So as ever, when we talk about these things, work within your competence, your scope of practice, and team up with other people within a multidisciplinary team to get the best results for your runners. Okay, I hope you found that useful. I hope there's going to be some carryover here into runners that you see in clinic. Some simple stuff around probably making their training intensity less in many cases, in including enough recovery and progressing gradually. And if we can get that stuff right, quite often we can avoid injuries in the first place, and it often leads to better performance for our runners. So a real win-win. Okay, thanks again for listening. Do make sure you check out our free series of running injury videos that I've linked to, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Bye for now.